Good morning and good evening to all of our viewers across the world. Today we have another special guest. Brien Foerster will be joining us. Brien is a preeminent researcher in the fields of elongated skulls, particularly those found in South America, and megalithic structures across the world. Brien's going to be joining us for a very brief impromptu interview coming right up, so stay tuned and I hope you enjoy. So I've studied a lot of your research, and I noticed that you have actually studied physics, chemistry, and mathematics formally in the academic environment. How has that helped you, or made you discover certain things, or given you an edge in your research, particularly in ancient skulls and this type of research?
Well, actually, and my major was actually biology. So it has helped me a lot because, having a scientific background, gives me the ability to study things in a way that, someone who doesn't have a scientific background would have difficulty with. And it also allows me to be able to converse with people such as doctors and nurses and dentists in order to um, study the difference between a normal skull and what some of these elongated skulls look like.
Right. And so these skulls, because I've looked at a lot of the pictures that you've had about these elongated skulls, and I mean it's absolutely incredible and amazing if these type of beings existed at some point in our history. What can you say about these crystal skulls in terms of when they lived, how long they lived, why did they demise, or what was the cause of their demise?
Well, they actually existed all over the world, or at least cranial deformation was a cultural practice that existed on every continent amongst different cultures, on average about 2,000 years ago. And the majority of them are obviously just some kind of head binding amongst the royal class of people. But the most intriguing ones were the Paracas people, which is actually where I am right now on the coast of Peru. They disappeared about 2,000 years ago, and their actual origins are not known. Even archaeologists will admit they don't know where this culture came from.
Hold on, that last part broke up on me. I think we have a weak signal. Can you just repeat that last part about where they came from?
Sure. Even archaeologists will admit that they don't know exactly where the Paracas came from and what the timeline is in terms of the creation of their culture initially.
Amazing. So, with them, with these elongated skulls, would you say they were a different type of race or breed of people, or were they basically just modern humans with certain type of elongated skull techniques for purposes of, like you mentioned, either royalty or something else that basically served a purpose maybe we're not aware of right now?
Well, we do know that they were only the royal class of people.
Hmm.
And some of the physical characteristics which we're about to study scientifically are that they seem to have had natural dark red hair, which is not typical of native people of the Americas. And genetically, I think they could have originally been a subspecies of human being. I don't think that they were simply the result of cranial deformation, because some of the skulls are larger than normal, and the shape of the skull is so complicated that I don't think it could be the result of simple cranial deformation techniques.
Interesting. So these people then, or these beings that were there, how old do you think they are? Do you think they're older than the human race, or do you think they're in a tandem line with the human race?
Honestly, I think that they were a small population of people from another part of the world that probably got chased out of their original territory and had to sail or be on a ship or ships of some kind to find a new homeland. And being a sailor and having studied the currents of the Pacific, it's quite possible that they were a small population of people from somewhere in the Middle East, and that they escaped from their attackers and wound up existing here in isolation on the coast of Peru.
Very interesting. That brings me to a side point that I wanted to mention. Did you ever hear about this? They discovered tombs and sarcophagus in the Grand Canyon area that looked like they were from Egypt.
Yeah, David Hatcher Childress has done a lot of work on that. And so have other researchers. The problem is that supposedly, once the Smithsonian found out about these relics and tombs, all of the evidence was taken away and is probably hiding in the basement of the Smithsonian at this time. And then that area, I believe, has been made off limits by the government. So no one's allowed to actually go in 100 years after the discovery and find out if, in fact, it's true or not.
That'd be amazing to discover what they have in there, right?
Oh, definitely.
So, what about back to the elongated skulls? Has a DNA analysis ever been done on them, and if so, what were the results, or some of the more significant results on these DNA analysis for the elongated skulls?
Well, it's been a real problem because ancient DNA, such as the Paracas, which are 2,000 plus years old, there are probably only about 10 laboratories on the planet that can actually work with material like that because it's so heavily degraded. The analogy I've thought of is your DNA would be like a very complex string or rope, and so it's intact, and so it's not difficult to decode that. But when you take that string and you put it in a blender and grind it up for 5 minutes, then it's only the most sophisticated computers that can possibly put that DNA material back together. And also we've had a problem that most laboratories don't want to touch the subject because it doesn't fit in with typical history.
That's interesting. So even though they see the skulls, even though they kind of verify that the skulls are not a byproduct of some type of what would you say, fraudulent advertisement, in the sense that they are legitimate skulls from beings that did live at one point, they still don't want to have anything to do with it. They still don't want to touch it.
Well, and unfortunately, that's typical of science. Most people, think that science is this great pursuit of the unknown, and in fact, in a lot of cases, it's just boys and girls clubs where they protect each other. They have an established set of knowledge and history that they believe in, and anything outside of that is rejected until it becomes so profoundly obvious that then they will accept it. And recently, of course, different subgroups of humanity have been discovered from the past, and it's taken a lot of time for the establishment to actually accept that these people did exist. And that's what we're hoping for with the Paracas elongated skulls.
Interesting. So with those skulls, did they have any particular special abilities that you're aware of over what you would consider modern human race? Were they were they more intelligent? Were they able to build things? Did they have are they a byproduct of the Nephilim, as some have suggested? Do you have any research or anything on that?
Well, the best person to talk to on that subject, my friend Eli Marzulli, who's in fact involved in the DNA testing process we're going through. The Paracas area is extreme desert, so in terms of construction materials, there is almost nothing here except the odd tree and sand for construction. But we do know that they had the most advanced technology in all of the Americas 2,000 years ago. They also knew about the potter's wheel. They knew how to deal with gold and silver, how to process that, and their system of agriculture was highly advanced, being in such a quite desolate and dry part of the world.
What about, did they have their hands involved at all in building any of the ancient monuments, like the Giza pyramids on the plateau, anything of that nature, or any of the seven wonders of the world? Do you know if the elongated skull race had any participation in that construction or development?
It's possible. The trouble is that in Egypt, we've never found an actual elongated skull. There are lots of artistic depictions, especially during the time of Akhenaten, where he allowed portrayals of him and his own especially members of his family, as having quite elongated skulls. And I think what he was doing was he was referencing to the past, saying that he descended from a non-typical type of human being.
Huh.
And on the coast of Peru, or at least in the highlands of Peru, of course, we have sites such as Machu Picchu and other megalithic constructions that were not made by the Inca. They clearly are thousands of years older, made by a mysterious race or races of people who had beyond 21st century technology.
Amazing. And are these elongated skulls then, the elongated skull species or the race, are they somehow tied in with the Nephilim at all, or is that something completely different?
It is possible, and that's why I'm working with L.A. Marzulli on the subject. He believes that the Nephilim were real and that they were the byproduct of human beings and some kind of outside intelligence, whether you believe in the biblical account or whether, in fact, it was off-world beings who came and lay down with the daughters of men, is a possibility. I honestly, again, believe that the elongated skulled people of Paracas could have come from the Middle Eastern area, and that's where the Nephilim are supposed to have lived. So it is a possibility that when the Israelites moved into the Levant and tried to kill off all of these giants slash Nephilim, etc., that some of them were able to escape. And it'll take DNA testing to actually find out whether or not we do have this Middle Eastern connection or not.
Interesting. Well, hopefully we'll all know that sooner than later, right?
Well, I hope so. It's been more than 3 years of just having problems with trying to find a lab that will do the testing, and also the prohibitive cost, which luckily has dropped by about 90% in the last 3 years.
Good.
So we do have leads on 2 major universities that are interested in this, but I can't divulge that to the public because it'll jeopardize the process that we're working on.
Right, right. And so in your research or discovery, when you've discovered, let's say, an elongated skull in Peru, I mean, you must have discovered far more than just skulls, probably bodies, I'm assuming, also clothes, relics, cultures that went along with that. What were some of the things other than elongated skulls when you were searching for the elongated skulls that you've discovered? Some amazing things.
Well, unfortunately, the skulls are usually separate from the bodies. The skulls that we have in the Forestry Museum, which is a private collection, mainly come from local people who have found them or dug them up. And so we never can find out where the actual exact tombs are, so we can't see skeletons are there. We do know that some of the Paracas appear to have been as much as 6 feet tall, which is much taller than contemporary people of the area, but that's what we really want to examine. There are more than 300 mummy bundles in the main museum in Lima, but they're not accessible by me at this time, and they are wrapped up in very complex textiles. So I would love to have an anatomist come and examine skeletons here that we can access and tell us if there are major physical anomalies. If these people were born with elongated skulls, then obviously the females would have to have a pelvis design different than a normal human being. That's something we're going to look into.
It's a good point, actually. That's a very good point. So about the elongated skulls, I mean, they must have had much more brain mass if they were that elongated, or do the skulls mimic that of a regular person that just has an elongated skull, or is there actually more volume in the cranium itself?
Well, I would say 95% of the skulls are the result of cranial deformation, of head binding, but it's the 5% which are very complicated, and some of them have cranial capacity of 30% larger than normal, as well as others physical characteristics that are strange. They seem to have these 2 holes in the back of their head, which are for blood and nerve flow. And doctors who have looked at that say it's either very, very uncommon, or they have no actual explanation as to why the holes are there. Also, the jaws are very big, almost like a Neanderthal, but it's the actual DNA testing that will give us a lot more information.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, what were some of the largest beings in terms of these beings? What were some of the largest ones you guys found? Were they on average just about 6 and 6.5 feet, or were they in some cases 8, 9, 10 feet, or even larger?
Well, the ones that I physically examined are about 6 feet, maybe 6 foot two. There are stories around, especially that we've heard from literally from professional tomb robbers, who say that they have found much larger skeletons in the area of 7 to 7.5 feet. But of course, they've sold those off to private collectors, probably in North America or Europe. So we're waiting to see if another one is unearthed, then hopefully I'll be able to get the ability to go and visit and study it before it winds up, hopefully, with the Peruvian government, which is where it should be, or back in the earth, where I think more properly it should be.
Right. Do you think the Peruvian government would divulge any of this information to the public if they got it, or do you think that they would hide it like the Smithsonian did with so many relics and samples?
Um, well, the Peruvian government is not like some other governments. They're not secretive. It is, it is believed that the Smithsonian does contain incredible ancient skeletons and other artifacts which don't fit history. The Peruvian government may very well have a number of these anomalous things too, but I don't think there's a real cover up by them. I think that if something doesn't fit the natural historic record, it's simply cataloged and put away until somebody can figure out what these things are.
Right. So often it does happen, right?
Oh, I think in most countries it happens.
Correct. Okay. So I wanted to just try to elaborate one more time on these beings that the elongated skull beings. So in terms of, I guess, their intelligent capacity, or in terms of being advanced beings, would you say overall they were far more superior in terms of technological developments and universal understanding than humans, or less than, or about on the same plane?
Well, the unfortunate thing is that the Paracas died out about 2,000 years ago. They were invaded from the north by a group that you may have heard of called the Nazca. And the
Mm-hmm.
Nazca, who supposedly made the lines and geoglyphs, were in fact only responsible for some of them. They were very warlike, and I believe that they exterminated the royal Paracas elongated skull people, who seem from from the little evidence we have in terms of pottery and textiles, that they were very philosophical in character, not really scientific as much, but they seem to be very peaceful, um, high thinkers, had very elaborate customs and artistry, and were vulnerable to the attack of a much more warlike people.
The Paracas were.
Yes, the Nazca were very warlike and violent, as depicted in their pottery and other artifacts, and so they have wiped out the Paracas royal bloodline and then have taken over the rest of the population, because, like in many cultures, the royal class would be small in number but very powerful in terms of influence. Once you literally decapitate them, then it's easy for a new group coming in to be able to take over the greater population.
Correct. And that's probably why, in many cases, there's only heads actually found of the Paracases and not the actual bodies, because maybe something like that did happen, a mass extermination where they intentionally decapitated him, right?
Yeah, we have actually found a graveyard between 50 and 100 skulls, which are elongated, and only other small amounts of other body parts. So they seem to have been buried violently en masse.
Hmm. How many years did these Paracas live on average, would you say?
We're guessing about 1,000 years,
1,000
but
years. Wow.
yeah, but because Uh, there are no carbon-14 testing labs in Peru. It's been very difficult to get actual scientific evidence of how far they go back, but most academics would estimate that the Paracas were around for between 800 and 1,000 years.
That's amazing. And what did they base that off of? Any type of archaeological records, or even some kind of minor carbon dating, or what was that based off of?
I think they did do very minimum carbon-14 dating of what they believe is the oldest site. But then again, it's such a vast area here that it could be that there are still important Paracas sites that have not been discovered that may be older.
Correct. And so, where are the majority of the Paracas skulls or these types of skulls generally located in Peru, or are they other places too, like Bolivia or Colombia, or are they other places in South America?
Well, in terms of the of skulls that have been excavated, the vast majority are in the Archaeology and Anthropology Museum in Lima.
Uh huh.
They have one room that contains 10,000 Peruvian skulls.
Oh
So
wow.
how many are elongated? We don't know. But also there are collections in many different museums in the United States and Europe. Most of that collecting was done prior to it being illegal to send out pre-Columbian artifacts from Peru.
Hmm.
But one of my most recent, actually my most recent books is The Elongated Skulls of Peru and Bolivia, and there were many different cultures that actually had skulls, including the famous Inca culture. We're now finding out that the original Inca may have had a very intriguing bloodline that was not exactly common Homo sapiens sapiens, but could have been much more complicated.
Interesting. And so the general accepted theory, or maybe even just theory in general, where this race of elongated skulls came from is actually Europe or the Middle East, or does anybody really not come to a consensus yet where exactly this race of beings came from?
Well, the oldest elongated skulls have been found in Iraq, which of course is in the Middle East. And then over time, there have been movements of these people or people like them from the Middle East into Eastern Europe and actually into Europe. Elongated skulls have been found in Germany, France, and recently Maria Wheatley wrote a book about the elongated skulls of Stonehenge, and that the royal class of people at Stonehenge in England, in fact, had elongated skulls, and that's why there you have burial mounds called burrows or barrows, and yeah, barrows is the term, and you have round barrows in which normal people are buried, and then long barrows in which elongated skull people are buried.
Huh. And when these elongated skulls, like you mentioned, there's been several discovered in Europe, have been discovered and presented to the scientific community, what do they generally say? Do they just outright dismiss it as forgery or hoax, or do they at least look into it, try to publicize something about it, and then it just gets ignored? How are these kind of things treated in places like Europe, for example, where many of these skulls have been discovered?
Um, I would I've not heard of one who will even entertain the idea that any of the elongated skulls are natural. They automatically that it's the result of head binding, and that's the problem is that an archaeologist is not a medical person, and so
Mm.
that's why I'm focusing my attention more on having medical people examine them to look for abnormalities and the possibility of what you can do in terms of head binding. As I said, some in Paracas are so complicated in shape that head binding would be almost impossible.